Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force 2 for the successor to the company challenge, Platoon Patrol. As the name implies, this is smaller scale. The idea is to get right down to small tactical building blocks and explore the strengths and weaknesses of different motorised or mechanised platoons. Which I mean the Shock Force because that gives us plenty to go at. It's not quite modern these days, we're dealing with how Battlefront modeled TOEs for 2008, but we've got the US Army, US Marines, Brits, Canadians, Germans and Dutch on the blue side, plus the Syrian Army, Republican Guard and potentially the Unconventionals for red, all of whom have multiple options for platoon-sized units that we can look at. The primary reason for jumping down to platoon level is to try and increase the diversity and experience. One of the realities of ground warfare is that terrain determines how you fight. Combat Mission is no different, and with the company challenges being intended to compare and contrast different TOEs, it made sense to control the terrain variable. The reality of that, though, was that we never really explored how different TOEs might influence tactical decision making. With the terrain staying the same, it didn't make much sense to alter the plan, so company challenges very quickly became exercises in how different units could carry out the same scheme of manoeuvre. That's probably a fairly reasonable way to directly compare unit effectiveness, but to some extent it also feels a bit like a range day with extra steps. Scaling down from company to platoon means significantly decreasing the footprint of the units being tested. Obviously, if the attackers and defenders take up less space on the map, they have more space to operate in. A relatively large map with complex terrain could conceivably offer space for multiple platoon attacks instead of a single company attack. Combining this with a selection of attacker start points and defender positions to be determined at random, I think we have a lot more scope for less repetitive actions, and for differences in TOE to shape decision making. This brings us around to our scenario for the Platoon Patrol. This is the map from the Armoured Assault scenario by George MC that comes with the British Forces module. It's roughly 2.5 kilometres long by 1.5 kilometres wide, giving us plenty of space, and it's got a really good mix of broken, rough terrain. We have 6 deployment zones for blue, corresponding to incoming roads, 1 to the north, 1 to the south, and 2 each to the east and west. There's a maximum of 5 AI plans, so that gives us 5 possible deployments for red that the game will randomly select when the scenario starts. The player can see the general areas they might be, but exactly where they are in that area is also going to be random, and of course, which area is occupied is going to be unknown until the shooting starts. As for the enemy, I've settled on a small detachment of US Marines. 1 12-man squad split down into teams, a platoon HQ and 2 small teams. The reason I picked the Marines is that they're armed to the teeth, they have plenty of firepower, optics and anti-tank weapons. Because I've embraced so much randomness in deployment here, they're not likely to be set up in a particularly sensible fashion, or maybe even facing the right way, so I've given their experience and motivation a bump to make up for it. In terms of objectives, the main aim is to see what tactical behaviour the different TOEs encourage, but I've also put 1,000 points on each side for casualties inflicted. Obviously any data we get from that is going to come with huge caveats because we're dealing with a small sample size and it's not really that clear what the points correspond to, especially in an engagement like this where it's very low level and things can be very swingy. But it could be interesting to rank all the competing platoons by what is essentially their kill-death ratio and comparing that to their QB points cost. To start off, we're going to bring out the old Shock Force staple, the US Stryker Infantry platoon. In some respects this is a kind of halfway house unit. It's better armed and more mobile than dismounted US Light Infantry, but it's also less well protected and has considerably less firepower than Bradley Infantry. In theory, it should make a good midfield starting point for the platoon challenge. I'd expect it to be at the top end of the APC mounted infantry, but not really in a position to compete with the IFV crowd. As usual, they're going to be regular experience with no modifiers, etc, etc. With our first platoon selected, all that's left to do is to start the scenario off, randomly select a deployment zone and get stuck in. We rolled up a 5, so that means we're starting off in the southwest, about 350 metres away from Objective Delta. This gives us an immediate tactical problem to deal with. We're out in the open on top of a causeway within small range of a potential enemy position. On either side we've got irrigation ditches with undergrowth, some of which is thick enough to be impassable to the Strikers. Luckily, this entry point extends beyond the confines of the causeway. I can deploy left or right. Going right, I'll have to cross the causeway and both of its flanking ditches to get to the objectives, so the obvious choice is left. Luckily, there's a bit of a depression just outside the setup zone I can use as a safe jumping off point. This is a sound move, but the terrain is still pretty rough, and the Strikers do not get across anywhere near as I would like. They get away with it, there's no sign of any enemy presence over at Delta, but there could have been, and this is a sign that I'm really going to have to consider the Strikers' cross-country performance as we go forward. Regardless, the platoon is now in a safe space, even if it's not as dispersed as I might like. The edge of the depression they're occupying offers a view over Delta, but also over Charlie, and to a lesser extent Echo in the distance, so I get 2nd Squad to grab the javelin from their vehicle and kick them out to go up to the crest and start observing. As their A team moves into position, they take fire from Delta. The assistant team leader goes down and the team hits the deck, but there's not even a contact icon, never mind a proper spot. In a way, this is good news though. Even though I don't know exactly where the enemy is, I now know they're at Delta, and I can concentrate my attention there. It's not only convenient, because I don't have to traipse all the way across the map to look for them, but it immediately vindicates my decision to get off the causeway. I want to see if I can build up a better picture of the enemy before I make a move though. The Weapons Squad A team runs off to the left with another javelin to try and get a better view from what looks like it used to be a Syrian tank position. They take another casualty in the process, but they make the spot. There's a Marine M249 gunner on the roof of the closest corner building in Delta. 2nd Squad Stryker flings a burst of 40mm grenades at them with the Mark 19 and he takes cover. Some of the grenades might have been close enough to cause some casualties, but it's impossible to tell. In the meantime, 3rd Squad dismounts and their Stryker heads up to peek over the crest where it starts suppressing the offending building with its 50. I can hear 1 or 2 other shots from Delta, so there's at least 1 more enemy team in there with line of sight, but I need to come up with a plan to deal with them. The options don't look amazing. Delta itself is a farm compound surrounded by undergrowth and trees. An irrigation ditch runs from the left along the edge of the outer wall to where it joins the causeway ditches on the right. In between Delta and the platoon's current position is an orchard made up of strips of undergrowth and small trees and bushes. The obvious approach is via the causeway ditches. That would take dismounted infantry right up to the edge of the compound, and a fire support position where the platoon is now could pie off Delta in coordination with an attack from that flank. Going straight up the middle is probably a terrible idea. There might be a little cover and concealment for the dismounts, but probably not enough, and the fire support element left behind would be shooting directly over their heads. Taking a left-hand approach pretty much involves the same kind of flanking movement as the right, but without the advantage of the ditches and a much more concerning reliance on concealment rather than cover. Of course, I'm totally mobile and have the option to just mount up in the Strikers and try to find a better avenue of attack if I like. I'm not sure there is one though, so that seems like a bit of a waste of time. I'm definitely reluctant to just close with the enemy though. Bringing infantry up via the causeway ditch just means they're walking into a CQB fight where it's very difficult to control the variables. My ideal fight here boils down to mulching the enemy at long range with the heavy weapons on the Strikers, and only going in with the infantry when I'm satisfied I have a significant advantage. To do that effectively, I really need concrete targets. I could blast all the likely positions with 50 cal and Mark 19 fire, but I don't have an infinite supply of ammunition, and if that kind of preparatory fire fails, I won't have the kind of firepower I need to bail out my dismounts. So what I've decided to do is to start to make my way down the right flank, but not commit to moving in and clearing the position until I feel like I've hammered it sufficiently. It's not really practical to bring the Strikers round, so they're going to stay where they are and form the base of fire along with the weapons squad while the platoon HQ and the rifle squads start to work their way forward. It all sounds solid in theory. In practice, the ditch is something of a muddy nightmare. The infantry rapidly start to tire themselves out slogging forward. The lead squad using the quick command gets fatigued and I have to drop them down to walking pace so that they're not useless by the time they reach the compound. In a wider context, slowing down like this is generally not good. It gives the enemy more time to figure out what's going on, more time to react, more time to reinforce or evacuate the position, more time to call in fires. Combined with the obvious avenue of approach offered by the ditch, it's easy to see how the last one in particular could quickly lead to disaster. Just because we don't have any wider context in this scenario and the AI is basically unreactive, doesn't mean that it's not important to acknowledge all that. What we do have here is essentially an extended period of direct preparatory fires. Ultimately, it's going to take about 15 minutes for the lead infantry squad, 3rd squad, to get into position. In that time, the strikers and the weapons squad keep Delta under observation, engage targets when they see them, and occasionally indulge in some area fire to try and take them out. Both of the MG teams fire off javelins, but the missiles are intercepted by the foliage surrounding the compound. At one point, some of the enemy fire an 84 at the Stryker, but it falls short, and every now and again they take potshots at reloading crewmen with a similar lack of success. Overall, it's hard to tell exactly what effect all my fire is having. As the rifle squads finally get into position, I have locations for 4 out of 6 enemy teams, and I have to contend with the possibility of positions in depth. I've split 2nd Squad's Javelin team off and run them over the causeway to get a good angle on the closest occupied building to the assault, but they also fail to spot anything. So what I want to do is work my way around the edge of Delta, closely coordinating action between the Strikers and dismounts in order to clear buildings with fire. Closing into assault is my last resort, not my go-to. The first target is the closest building on the right corner. 3rd Squad starts climbing the ditch towards the compound wall as a torrent of Mark 19 and 50 cal fire goes over their heads to suppress the target and adjacent buildings. The closest face of the target building has already been knocked in by 40mm grenades. 2nd Squad's Javelin team further back put their missile right into it as a bit of a bonus. Moving up on the next turn, 3rd engages an enemy soldier on the roof and, eventually, takes him out. There are already 2 bodies on the ground floor from the enemy platoon HQ, plus a dead small gunner on the roof, so I know that's 2 important enemy teams that are out of the picture. I still don't want to go into the compound yet though, so 3rd Squad stays where they are and don't occupy the building. 1st Squad is coming up in the ditch behind them to leapfrog round and attack the next building along from the flank, while 2nd brings in its detached Javelin team and starts to move up to join the assault. Again though, the ditch is a nightmare. 1st Squad has actually already taken a casualty. The saw gunner in their B team got shot through a narrow keyhole from the left side of Delta even though he was in the ditch. The team is pinned for a little while they recover, slowing down the squad's progress through the thick mud even more. 3rd Squad starts taking fire in the meanwhile from the far right corner of the compound. I know there are enemy in that building. They've been getting their dose of suppressive fire, but the Marines in there are now firing from a window that the Strikers can't see. Worse, 3rd Squad is experiencing some combat mission action square clustering in that window's exact keyhole, and while they do give some fire back, the enemy is punting 40mm grenades at them, and if they get a direct hit, that's going to really ruin my day. They manage to eventually crawl out of position, though one man catches a grenade fragment and is lightly wounded. 1st Squad has actually been in position for a couple of turns by this point, but I'm waiting before bringing them up to hit the enemy's flank. To begin with, they're borderline exhausted and they need a few minutes to catch their breath if I want them to perform. Secondly, I'm repositioning one of the Mark 19 Strikers. The new target building is in an awkward position for my base of fire, so I've decided to bring one of the Strikers right, through the ditch and up onto the causeway where it can get a better angle and, if necessary, follow up the infantry for close support. I had written this kind of move off earlier, but with one of the enemy small teams confirmed out of action, it's a much more acceptable risk now. After a barrage of 40mm grenades, 3rd Squad moves up again and take the building under fire from the front, along with one of the 50 cal Strikers, while 1st Squad moves up to the wall. It turns out they can't actually see the building from there, the wall's right on the edge of the ditch, so both fire teams pop smoke and go over the top. They can see 3 dead enemy soldiers through the windows, but they shoot the building up regardless and toss some grenades inside to seal the deal and get the 4th one. That clears the right edge of Delta. There was definitely an enemy team in the close left corner, but they're probably out of action, judging by the lack of outgoing fire and the collapsed roof. The only other contact I've had is from a shed next to that building. There are definitely enemies still there. One of 1st Squad's men comes under fire and gets shot when he corner posts the left side of the building they've just cleared. 3rd Squad's B team tries to close in with support from the Strikers, aiming to occupy a nearby building and take the enemy under fire, but they lose a man on the approach and then 2 more when they get inside. It looks like all the remaining Marines are crammed into that one building. The first squad tries to reposition to the right, following the compound wall round to get an angle, but the wall runs into a dip in the terrain and there really isn't line of sight. The Mark 19 Stryker back in the fire support position has run out of ammunition. The other one follows the causeway round and splurges its remaining ammo directly into the building, but this has no apparent effect. Unwilling to try and tackle the shed from the front, eventually I bring second squad up out of the ditch and send them across the orchard to come up behind the enemy. There are no windows on this side of the building, so they're pretty safe, and it's already been weakened by all the supporting fire. Second squad managed to collapse the facing wall with some 40mm grenades. Pouring the fire on, a few more hits bring the whole building down and the enemy inside are finally dealt with. After a couple more turns, I hit the ceasefire button. All the Marines are out of action at the price of 7 men from the Stryker platoon. If we tot up the points values, that makes for 1,000 points for wiping out the enemy, minus 71 points for casualties, for a total score of 929. We made contact on turn 3 and ceasefired on turn 50, which means our attack took 47 minutes. So how did the Stryker Infantry do in our platoon patrol? This is obviously the first platoon we put through its paces here, so we don't really have a good point of comparison. The combination of entry point and enemy deployment gave us a pretty textbook platoon attack setup. We made contact from a decent support by fire position that very conveniently had a covered approach onto the enemy flank. Ultimately, both the base of fire and the assault elements did exactly what they were supposed to do. There were no major casualty incidents, mostly just incidental individual losses, except for the 3 losses from 3rd Squad's B team trying to close in on an enemy position that turned out to be a lot less suppressed than I thought. I think we can put that down to an error of judgment rather than some kind of TOE issue. To think about the engagement inside some kind of framework, I think we can hit the iron triangle and consider it in terms of mobility, firepower and protection. Right from the start, Entry 5 presented some issues for the Strykers. There's a lot of light forest tiles in that area, so undergrowth, scrub, etc., and the Strykers struggled. This really served to hem them in. I was in the process of sending one vehicle forward right at the end to back up second squad, and it took a couple of minutes to get across the orchard in the centre. That's a very long time to be out in the open against an enemy with anti-tank weapons. I've talked about how the right was constrained by the causeway, but the left was also very restricted. The orchard expands left for a good way, and there's a narrow choke point between it and a farm just to the left of the fire support position that made that flank a really unattractive prospect. So my options to change my avenue of attack at the start were pretty poor, and it was somewhat problematic manoeuvring the Strykers into more relevant firing positions as the game went on. That said, while I think tracked vehicles might have dealt with the terrain better, they would still be slowed down. Forest tiles in combat missions simply represent problematic terrain for vehicles, so while the Strykers might have been impacted more in this particular case than some other vehicles, they're somewhere on a sliding scale of manoeuvre difficulty along with every other platoon, rather than being specifically constrained. Thinking about the dismounts, the avenue of approach up the ditch was very slow, but I suspect that's a universal infantry problem. Wading through the mud in the bottom of the ditch might in theory be more of a pain for heavily laden Western-style soldiers than, say, an insurgent with nothing but an AK, but I don't think that's modelled in the game. What is modelled in combat mission, though, is the reality that taking a long time to get into the assault position meant that the base of fire had to keep working for a longer time. That wasn't a problem for the Strykers with M2s or the weapons squad with its M240s, who could scrounge extra ammo from the nearby vehicles, but it did become a problem for the Mark 19s, which fired off their entire ammunition load. This is partly a simple exercise of bigger, bulkier ammunition translating into fewer rounds carried versus an extended period of shooting up the Delta compound, but it's also related to the way Mark 19 fire is modelled in combat mission. For whatever reason, in-game Mark 19s are not very accurate. This can be very useful when engaging in area fire, especially against infantry in the open, but is something of a pain when you're targeting specific buildings like I was doing here. In CM terms, they are definitely considerably less efficient in terms of ammo expenditure than other weapons. Despite that, they certainly felt like they were effective. Not necessarily in terms of casualties, only one of them actually racked up any kills, and it only got 3 compared to the 6 inflicted by the 50s, but in terms of suppression. That's very hard to quantify, of course, but I suspect all those 40mm grenades did a lot of work to grease the tactical wheels at times. With regards to the infantry's firepower, I don't think I encountered any problems. The rifle squads got in and did their job. Having LMGs and grenade launchers down at fireteam level seemed very useful. The weapons squad M240s were further away from the action and mostly engaged in keeping the compound suppressed from the base of fire position, so they were a little bit outshone by the heavier weapons on the vehicles, but that was still a good place for them. Not an issue here, but if there was an armoured threat present, keeping some infantry teams back with the Strykers where they can acquire and use a couple of javelins would obviously be a good idea. Overall, the 19 casualties inflicted break down 10 to 9 in favour of the infantry, so things were pretty balanced, though 5 of the infantry kills came right at the end when 2nd Squad cleared the last position. In terms of protection, a couple of dismounts might have been saved by their body armour. The weapons squad leader took a round near the start and carried on, and one of 3rd Squad's soldiers caught some shrapnel from a 40mm grenade. It's not clear whether those were just flesh wounds or whether the armour helped, but assuming it did means that it definitely cut down on casualties and probably prevented more men from being injured by that 40mm grenade detonation. The Strykers meanwhile were never really tested. The enemy got a single anti-tank weapon off in their direction and it missed. They did target reloading gunners with some consistency, but never scored any hits doing so. I suspect this is because incoming rounds were aimed centre mass at the gunners and they were effectively shielded by the RWS mount. Opened up crew tend to have a high fatality rate in combat mission. There's some evidence that infantry get bonuses when they try to snipe tank commanders. So keeping the vehicles at range and face onto the enemy where the gunners benefited from the relative position of the RWS probably did some of the heavy lifting here. So that is the Stryker Infantry platoon's run through the platoon patrol. I think this is going to be a solid performance. In terms of QB cost, they come out at 761 points, ranking 9th out of 17 in our prospective lineup. We'll have to get some more results in before we can see any trends develop though. Hope you all enjoyed this one. If you'd like to see videos early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.